welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. It's been a busy few weeks at the Old Front Line headquarters, as next month I head out to Italy for a couple of weeks to take a battlefield tour, a battlefield group to the battlefields of Anzio and Monte Cassino and the Sangro and Ortona. And for me, it is a kind of crisscross pathway between those two great conflicts, because there are so many shadows from the Great War that seem to linger over some of those sites from the Second Great War, particularly in that Italian campaign. My own father fought at Anzio, and that was probably the nearest that British soldiers in Europe got to the experience of the First World War, dug in the trenches and the waddies of that static front. So I've been busy getting all the episodes ready so there's no interruption in the podcasts that are released over the course of the next few weeks. And as always, every day, emails come in from you, the listeners, with all kinds of queries and questions, and I really, really enjoy that. And also people send in supplementary information. So we just had a recent episode on the Menin Road, that journey along the Menin Road and across that landscape of Flanders. And the Menin Road is something that I'd always assumed to be a Roman road because of its design and the route that it followed on that kind of edge of that part of the Roman world. But a listener's contacted me to send me some information to show the road as we kind of know it from a First World War perspective was actually built by the Austrians in the 18th century. So it's a fascinating way, this podcast, for me to learn new things, and hopefully you learn new things too. And I very much appreciate the kind of interaction that I have with you, where you feel free to send in this kind of material and pointers to additional kind of knowledge as we layer up our understanding of those landscapes of the First World War and much of their earlier history, which is so important, I think. So that's really at the very heart of what these question and answer episodes are about, where you pose the questions, I put forward an answer. Often we get some additional material coming from you, the listeners, too, and together we all learn, and long may that continue. So let's get down to this week's questions. And our first question comes from Steve McQuaid. There are two villages, Arkholm and Netherkettle, very close to my hometown, which are doubly thankful they didn't lose anyone in either World War. Are there any French communes that are thankful, or indeed doubly thankful? I guess that there may be quite a few that didn't lose anyone in World War II, but given the scale of French commitments in the First World War, are there any communes in France that are thankful in terms of the Great War? Well, first of all, what are thankful villages? That is a British phrase for more than 50 locations in the United Kingdom that sent men to war in 1914, and they all came back. So that was no casualties, no fatal casualties from those villages. And there's no war memorial in those villages as well. We're kind of used to going across the landscape of Britain and seeing those shadows of the Great War in terms of monuments and memorials and plaques in churches and all kinds of different memoria to the dead of that conflict of 1914-18. But there were incredibly some places that didn't lose anybody. We have to always remember that not everybody died in the Great War. In fact, most men came home. But the scale of loss, as great as it was, unparalleled as it was, it didn't necessarily affect everywhere. So in the UK, we know there's over 50 of these, and there are some that sent men across to fight in the First World War, and they all came home, and there are even some that sent men as well in the Second World War, and they all came home as well. Now, in terms of France, when we look at the population of France in 1914, country much bigger than the United Kingdom, in fact, its population is pretty similar to the UK population, in fact, slightly less. And by the end of the war, France had lost nearly 1.4 million dead on the battlefields of that conflict, and the UK had lost about 750,000 dead, which, in terms of the French experience, France lost almost twice as many as the UK. So I guess what that probably points to is that the chances of thankful villages in France are pretty thin indeed because of the scale of that French loss and the way that it affected such a big proportion of the male population in France. But there is one commune that is known to be a thankful village, but that is not the phrase that is used in France. In fact, I don't think there is a phrase for this. And that commune is Thierville in the department of the Eure, southeast of Le Havre. And it's a small commune of about 300 people. It has a church. I had a look at it on Street View. I've never been to that particular village myself. It's a typical Normandy village, but it doesn't have a war memorial because no one from Thierville was killed in the Great War. And that's pretty unusual. In fact, I think it only came to light when the BBC, around the time of the centenary, started looking into these kind of stories, and they discovered that there was this commune that did not have any men killed. And they went and sent a reporter there and covered that in a little story. And I'll put a link to that onto the podcast website. So that one has been identified as a thankful village in France. Whether there are more, I'm not entirely certain. But I think the chances of a village that didn't lose anybody in the Great War and then again in the Second World War is pretty slim. Now, I say that knowing that the scale of French losses in the Second World War was much smaller than the Great War. The French army went to war in 1939 and sat on the Maginot Line along the border, and then the German Blitzkrieg came in May 1940 with the Battle of France, and there were huge losses and huge numbers of men taken prisoner as a consequence of that fighting, but it wasn't an army destroyed, suffered in the same way that an army in France had suffered during those 4 years of the Great War. And of course, 4 years of occupation then followed. So then again, under occupation, the scale of casualties couldn't be comparable to a battlefield as such, but casualties in France in the Second World War, particularly in that 1940, post the armistice, post the surrender of France, through to the time of the liberation, they were all different compared to the French experience of the Great War. People, men, women, children, were deported to camps where they were murdered in concentration camps across Europe. People were sent to work in Germany and never returned. People joined the French resistance and were arrested and executed. And then latterly, once the Allies, in particular in the lead up to Normandy, began to bomb positions within France, railheads, rail junctions, all kinds of locations, there was a large scale of civilian casualties as well from the bombing, and particularly in the Battle of Normandy, with the bombing of the city of Caen and many of the villages in the main battle area, the level of civilian casualties were quite high. So when we look at memorials in these French villages from the point of view of the Second World War, we see more non-battlefield casualties. We see civilians as combatants being killed or murdered. We see civilians being sent to their death simply because of their religion, their status, their background. And we see ordinary men and women, families, children, even babies being killed in bombardments, whether that's from German shells on a battlefield or from Allied bombs in the preparation for D-Day. So it's a very different kind of experience. And I think you would be surprised as to how many communes across France have those kind of casualties. If you went, coming back to the Great War, if you went behind the German front from northern France down into eastern France, into the occupied part of France where the German army was for most of the 4 years, you would find a scale of this there as well, because the Germans didn't just do this in the Second World War. There were massacres of civilians, particularly in Belgium, but also there were civilians murdered within France. There wasn't a resistance movement, of course, but there were those who stood up to the Germans and often paid for that with their lives. And as the offensives moved forward, particularly in the final phase of the Great War, then the villages that had been safe away from the battlefront suddenly stood in the path of an Allied advance, and shells came down onto those villages and farms, and civilians were killed. So France, in two great conflicts, suffered civilian casualties on a kind of scale that had never really been experienced in its history before. Conflict had always touched civilians one way or another, but this new total war, industrial war, was going to threaten civilian life in a way that no other conflict had ever done and change warfare forever. So, to come back to your question, Steve, there appears to be only this one village, but I think what your question really interestingly does is kind of highlight this whole aspect of France's casualties in two world wars, how they compare and how they differ. And it's important, I think, to understand the scale of the catastrophe to France in both world wars of these conflicts and how it really affected France for the rest of that century, a subject that I'm sure we will return to many, many times. So moving on to question number 2, this comes from Nathan Armstrong. I'm off to the Western Front in about 6 weeks or so, and for the first time in a few years, we're heading down to Verdun. Thank you for educating me about this place via the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to my visit. As I'm sure you'll remember, Richard Holmes produced the excellent late 90s documentary series, The Western Front, and in the episode relating to Verdun, he references a German base called Camp Elisabeth. I've tried to locate it in the hope of visiting, but I can't find where it is. Are you able to point me in the right direction, assuming, of course, that it still exists as the documentary is about 25 years old? Well, Professor Richard Holmes wrote many books about the Great War. I had the honour of sharing a stage with him at a couple of Western Front meetings where we both were giving talks. He was a very affable, very knowledgeable person and good at explaining complex history in an understandable way to an ordinary audience. And he did a lot, no doubt, in that 90s period to bring about a expansion of the kind of interest in the First World War in the same way that John Giles and Martin Middlebrook and Lynn MacDonald and Rose Coombs had helped regenerate that interest in the decades that had come before that. And the Western Front series that you refer to is certainly one of those. And it's a shame these aren't more easily available to watch. They really should all be on iPlayer, as they were all BBC programmes, but sadly they're not. Now, in terms of Camp Elisabeth, which, if I remember correctly, they filmed Richard Holmes visiting this, and this was a location behind the German front line in the Verdun sector, away from the front where German soldiers were billeted, and it was a kind of a reconstruction, kind of what was left, to give people an idea of the kind of locations where German soldiers slept as they were going to and from the line. And I'm pleased to say it is still there. I went some years ago. I haven't been for a while. It's kind of slightly outside the main Verdun area, although it's close to some of the areas where, in fact, the Americans fought some of their final battles on the 11th of November 1918. So where it is located in the village of Azan, which is northeast of Verdun, not far from Colonel Drion's command post, where the battle began in February of 1916. And Azan and that area was very much behind the German lines for most of the war, and the villages in that area were used for billeting German troops. The civilians were largely evacuated away, so the Germans could go about their business. They didn't want civilian eyes on the kind of military activities that they were doing, no doubt, and they utilised the farms and the barns and all the buildings that were there for military purposes, for billeting troops, storing supplies and everything else. And Camp Elisabeth is a reconstruction of the wider camps that were built in that area to keep that kind of engine of war that was the German side of the Battle of Verdun going, particularly in 1916. And it's also an area, Azan itself has German military cemeteries, and you can see some of the dead, and some of those cemeteries there still have some of the original headstones in and unit memorials as well. So it's worth kind of exploring those when you are in that area. So where it is today is actually in what we would call an open-air museum. There is one of these open-air museums just up from the village of Verdun, and it's called Les Vieux Métiers d'Autrefois, And it's not just got Great War history in it, it's got the history of this area of the Meuse going back over many centuries with reconstructed buildings and workplaces, and also this reconstructed German camp from the Great War. And in there you will find bits of trench railway, there's dugouts and shelters, there's a water tower and all kinds of kit, equipment, and also the logistics kind of related kit in there as well, because that's what these camps were about: sheltering men, places where men could rest before they went back to the trenches, and also building up war material that could then be shipped by these light railway systems up to the frontline area to keep the battle, keep the offensive, keep the German war engine kind of going, really. And the camp itself is named, it's an unusual name, Camp Elisabeth. It's actually named after Elizabeth Emile Eugene de Wittelsbach, who was the Duchess of Bavaria and later Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after she married Joseph I, and until she was assassinated in 1898, an event that had taken place nearly 2 decades before the Great War, but obviously still remembered, I would guess, by perhaps the Bavarian troops that were in this area, although the Austro-Hungarian Empire did actually send some combat troops to the Western Front, and they fought in this eastern part of the front, obviously on the German side of the battlefield alongside German units. So maybe there's some kind of connection there, although I suspect it's more to do with the Bavarian side of things, because a lot of Bavarian units came to fight at Verdun in 1916. So I hope that helps, Nathan, with the location of this, and I'll put a map, a Google map, onto the podcast website so you can see where it is. But this whole area behind the front, both on the German side and on the Allied side, we tend to focus on the main battlefields themselves, the places where the trenches were and the forts and the mine craters and all of that kind of battlefield-related activity, the bombs, the bullets and the bayonets. But the places behind the front are just as important. And we've tried on this podcast a few times to kind of direct you as visitors to these behind-the-lines locations. We've done it from a British and Commonwealth perspective. It's long overdue for me to do something, for example, on the Somme from the German perspective, behind the lines on the German front in that Somme sector. But I think that even at places like Verdun, where the infrastructure went from north of Verdun right up towards the Belgian border in the Belgian Ardennes, there's a whole host of places there that you can go and visit. Railway stations that were specially built to bring in the shells that were needed for the massive Verdun bombardment, gun platforms for the super heavy howitzers, including some for some of the 420s, the big Berthas that were used to fire onto the forts and other locations on that Verdun battlefield. And again, kind of all of the area behind the German lines that service their troops moving forward, billeting villages, and also the locations of their medical facilities. And when you have that, a German cemetery is normally not that far away. And while the vast majority in many of these Great War battlefields of the German dead were concentrated into larger cemeteries, what you do see in eastern France is a larger number of, in inverted commas, original cemeteries that are on the site of original wartime burial grounds where the Germans were buried at the time. And again, just like the cemetery at Azan, they often contain original gravestones, because when the cemeteries were made into what we see today in the 50s, a lot of those German cemeteries had very ornate headstones in, and in some cases they were pushed to the edge of the cemetery. They couldn't quite bring themselves to destroy them. They were pushed to the edge of the cemetery and kind of preserved in that way. And I don't think that was done with every headstone. Why some were kept and others not, I mean, who knows? But it is worth exploring these areas beyond the actual battlefield, the areas behind the lines, to find all of these kind of treasures. And I always feel that when you explore a place like Verdun and the wider area beyond it, you're kind of exploring in a way that you explored when you first visited any of these battlefields of the Great War, because you never quite know what you're going to find round the corner. I mean, Google Maps helps with that, of course, but there is still this feeling of discovery. So let us know how you get on, Nathan. Send some pictures in. It'd be great to hear what your experience today is of Camp Elisabeth compared to what you saw of Richard Holmes visiting it back in the 1990s. So a great question and a great way of bringing up a great man. Moving on to question number 3. This comes from James Clements. James says, I'm interested if you have any accounts from veterans who experienced something unexplainable, spiritual or paranormal during the Great War. Events in the same vein to Will Bird being rescued by his deceased brother, or the account I believe that was Aubrey Rose when he was knocked unconscious in a trench. I can't find the episode you mentioned Audrey's encounter with this. Well, James, it's an interesting subject, and quite a few of the veterans that I spoke to mentioned things like this. Aubrey Rose, who you rightly say had one of these experiences, he was in the Queen's Westminster Rifles, 16th London Regiment, went over the top at Gommecourt on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, got into the German trenches, saw his officer killed, saw some of his mates killed, got back across no man's land, and then was sent towards Hebuterne village to try and rejoin what was left of his battalion when a shrapnel shell exploded above the trench he was in, really seriously wounded him, and he lost consciousness, and he remained unconscious for quite some time. He was evacuated, unbeknown to him, to a dressing station and then to a casualty clearing station and sent on a hospital train to the coast, where he went into one of the base hospitals there for treatment. And while he was there, he had this very, very vivid dream that he remembered for the rest of his life. And he told me this many, many times, and the story never changed. He was led into this big, long, kind of medieval hall where there was a big, long table, and at the end of that table was a cloaked figure who was sitting at a desk with a quill pen and a huge ledger, and he was writing something in this ledger. And Aubrey Rose was led to him, kind of looked over his shoulders and saw that he was writing the names of Aubrey Rose's comrades who had fallen at Gommecourt on the first day of the Somme. And then in the next line he began to write Rifleman Aubrey Rose, and at that point Aubrey Rose shouted out when he saw his own name being written in this ledger, and he woke up in the hospital and there was an army nurse staring at him. So that was his kind of spiritual, paranormal, whatever you're going to call it, story. And a few of them told me stories like this where they had kind of premonitions, really. So Malcolm Vivian, who I've mentioned many times on this podcast, was in an observation post at Monchy-au-Bois, which was just north of Gommecourt, so not far from where Aubrey Rose was wounded on the first day of the Somme. In fact, Malcolm Vivian watched that attack go in from another observation post overlooking Gommecourt Park. Anyway, he's up on the Monchy-au-Bois sector, which was a fairly quiet sector north of the main Somme area, and he's in an observation post, and there's some degree of German activity, and it's his time in the OP, the observation post, is coming to an end, and a new team, another officer and some signallers are coming in to take over, and he then walks out of the dugouts, down the trench, starting to walk away, and he gets this strange feeling as if something is wrong, and he turns around to go back just as shells hit the OP, collapse it in, bury some of the men are in there, and together him and his signallers dig them all out, drag them out, and their lives are saved. He always felt, he said, that if he'd have just carried on and not had that feeling, he would have heard the bombardment, but shells were normal on any part of the front. He might have just carried on, but he had this feeling that he must go back, and going back, him and his men helped save the lives of the ones that had been entombed in that observation post. So these kind of things happen, I guess, in all kinds of avenues of life, whether they're prompted by the war, whether they're prompted by the experience of war, who knows. Those, I don't know, perhaps are easy to explain or easier to explain. Less easy to explain is the one that you also mentioned in your question, which is Will Bird, who was a soldier in the 42nd Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Black Watch of Canada. He went right through from 1916 until the end of the war, was awarded the Military Medal for his bravery. He became a journalist. He wrote a lot of material about the First World War and went on to write some Second World War regimental histories as well. And he wrote a book which was originally published, And We Go On, which is his memoirs, effectively, that was later republished with the title Ghosts Have Warm Hands. And this refers to an incident when his brother, who'd been killed in 1915, appeared to him in a dugout, I think on Vimy Ridge, and was standing in front of him, put his hands out and grasped Will Bird's hands, and Will Bird felt the warmth of his brother's hand, felt him leading him up out of the dugout, up the dugout steps, into the trench, and just as he did do, he kind of came round, his brother disappeared, shells pitched out the darkness, went straight in the dugout and wiped out everybody inside. And that ghost, that apparition, whatever it was, had led him out into safety and saved his life. Now, we've got no way of verifying that Will Bird could have been at the company rum. I mean, who knows? But it's certainly an interesting story. And he was a great storyteller, Will Bird, but you kind of get the feeling that he doesn't exaggerate his experiences. The book is very honest throughout its account of his time on the Western Front. So we can make what we will of this. I mean, I have an open mind about these things. For many of us travelling to the battlefields of the Great War, we feel an atmosphere, we feel a presence. Many people have been to High Wood and know what happened there and have felt a dark presence there. Perhaps we're over-imagining the situation. I remember long before the centenary, a television company that was making a series of programmes about places where a lot of people had died and was there any kind of atmosphere or stories of ghosts there, called me when I was living at Courcelette to ask me about this. And I said that while I had heard stories from English visitors to those battlefields, I'd never heard a single French person tell a ghost story about the Somme. And if legions of ghostly soldiers are marching down the Albert-Bapaume road or walking through the trees at Mametz Wood or whatever it is, at some point a Frenchman would have seen it, and this kind of story would have been relayed in a local cafe or a bar or whatever. But I can't say I've ever come across it. But there are many hints at this, by the men who were there, not just us who visit today. Sassoon wrote a poem called 200 Years After, where he says, "Trudging up by Corby Ridge one winter's night, unless old hearsay memories tricked his sight, along the pallid edge of the quiet sky, he watched a nosing lorry grinding on, and straggling files of men. When these were gone, a double limber and 6 mules went by, hauling the rations up through ruts and mud to trench lines digged 200 years ago. Then darkness hid them with a rainy scud, and soon he saw the village lights below." But when he told his tale, an old man said that he'd seen soldiers pass along that hill. Poor silent things they were, the English dead, who came to fight in France and got their fill. Now that's kind of two things at once, really. A reference to a kind of ghost story that might appear 200 years after the Great War as columns of British Tommies marched that landscape as ghostly apparitions to the locals. And also, I think, the bitterness of Siegfried Sassoon and how he felt about the losses of men and what those losses, what that sacrifice meant. Perhaps another subject. But this is a fascinating element of the Great War. We spoke recently about Raymond Lodge and Sir Oliver Lodge, a great proponent of spiritualism in Britain during the First World War period. And perhaps there is a subject to return to one day, looking at this whole element of spiritualism and spiritual, paranormal behaviour, phenomena, whatever we're going to call it, on these battlefields and in the stories of the Great War, because you can read plenty of newspaper articles about mothers seeing their sons appear to them by the side of their bed, and then just a few days later the telegram arrives to say that they've been killed in action. Again, we can make what we will of this, but it's certainly an element, I guess, of the human experience of war and how humans relate and react to loss. So thank you, James. Really great question, which I think is a starting point for this subject for us here on the Old Front Line. Our fourth and final question comes from Eric Holmstig. Eric asks, "I'd like to know how life was organised further behind the front line. There were large numbers of British soldiers and a French civilian population who, as best as they could, would live their lives parallel to the military and their needs. I assume that there were conflicts of interest between the French population and the British military. Surely it must also have been in the interest of the French state that the areas under British occupation, in inverted commas, could produce and deliver as much food and other supplies as possible to the French war economy, not least when large parts of northern France were occupied by the Germans and could no longer contribute to France's livelihood. And of course, some British activities would have long-lasting effects locally, such as the building and creation of military cemeteries." So thanks for this, Eric. It kind of hints a little bit at what we were talking about earlier about behind the lines and the importance of that in terms of the military experience in the Great War and the battlefields as they are today. But you raised quite a few different questions in there, really. And when we think of an army like the British Army, British and Commonwealth forces, working in that battle zone where the front lines were and extending their kind of lines of communication and supply right back to the coast, it means that there was this huge swathe of France that was affected directly by British and Commonwealth soldiers being there. Trucks going along roads where normally no trucks would be seen, railways running overtime as they bring up shells and food and bully beef and all the other things that are needed for the front line area, men living in villages, in barns, in the fields, in camps, taking up ground, the military creating supply depots, so farmland that had once been the occupation of Pierre was now owned temporarily by the British Army, and they had all kinds of kit laid out there. And so from the very beginning, because France was an ally, the British Army just couldn't rock up and take this ground, take over these buildings, use what they want. There had to be a negotiation. So in each area, there would be town majors who were officers commanding specific areas, be in charge of that would be fluent French speakers normally, who would negotiate with local mayors and local dignitaries to ensure that there would be free passage of British and Commonwealth forces. They would negotiate what the cost of billeting would be, because they would have to pay money to French families and French landowners and French property owners to use barns and other buildings for military purposes. When damage was done in fields or on roads or within the buildings itself, there aren't that many town major war diaries that survive, but there are some in the National Archives. And I remember looking at the one for Popperinga up in Belgium and another one from one of the towns down in France. And a lot of it is where they're dealing with locals who come to them and say, these British soldiers in their big size 10 army boots have come into my house and they've caused all kind of damage, and I need some kind of reparation, some kind of payment to make good for that. So town majors and other officers were detailed with this kind of work. And were there exaggerated claims of damage so that French people could get more money? Quite probably, because the war had affected everybody and everyone was short of money, and people see an opportunity to do that kind of thing, and I'm sure that went on. And I remember Albert Chesters, who served with the 17th Royal Welsh Fusiliers, one of the veterans that I interviewed, talking about how when they were marching down from northern France to the Somme, it was very hot, and they spent some time in a farm briefly before they moved on. And there was a water pump, and they wanted to refill their water bottles, and the farmer would only do that if they paid him. And their attitude was, listen, mate, we're here fighting for you, fighting for France to kick the Germans out. Surely you should at least give us some water. But the civilian population in these battle areas were under great pressure. They'd lost all of their manpower, the men of military age gone off to fight. And communities were being run by women or very old men, and money was scarce. So you can't really blame anyone under these circumstances for trying to find a way to earn a bit of an extra crust in those very, very difficult times. But when you read the accounts of soldiers who were in the Great War, these are kind of one level of the spectrum. Let's go to the other one. You read how French families took British soldiers in, treated them like their own sons, gave them food that they knew was scarce, treats, all kinds of things, and treated them like royalty. So it wasn't just people trying to make money out of the Tommies who were there in the Great War. And as you hint at, it was really important for the French government to ensure that these areas of farmland, for example, continued to be farmland. Plant crops, harvest those crops, keep the fields full of cattle, keep that rural economy going, which is so vital to feed the rest of France. And in those areas where British troops were close to this farmland, close to this kind of agricultural activity, there are quite a few examples of British soldiers putting down their military attire and going into those fields, men who'd worked on the farms themselves before the Great War, and helping the French people harvest, because they're short of manpower to do that. And they go in and they assist them. So there is that kind of cooperation going on there as well. So there wasn't always argy-bargy, there wasn't always friction behind the lines. There was a lot of cooperation too. And of course, all of this had a long-lasting effect on both sides. So for the French people, they kind of never forgot the experience they had with British soldiers in these places during the Great War. Many of them stayed in touch. I mean, I have had family members come on battlefield tours with me whose father, grandfather had been killed in the Great War, had been billeted with a French family. That French family had stayed in touch and had helped them visit the battlefields after the war to go and visit that relative's grave. So that kind of thing went on. And on the British side, I think that the men who came home never forgot the kind of hospitality that they'd had. Many of the veterans that I interviewed spoke about it fondly. It wasn't just Albert Chesters who'd been robbed of his water. There were many others who had had great times with French people in those villages and towns behind the front line. And it was a bond that often stayed for the rest of their lives. When you read George Coppard and his account, Machine Gun to Cambrai, he talks about going back to the battlefields to see some of the people that he was billeted with during the First World War. And you mentioned right at the end there, Eric, and I think this is a really good element of it, the lasting effect of the creation and building of military cemeteries, because across that landscape of northern France, where the British and Commonwealth forces had fought, the dead were buried in cemeteries, in isolated graves, which eventually were then brought into larger cemeteries, concentrated in, and wartime cemeteries were made permanent, and hundreds of these silent cities in stone were created across that area of France. And this created a lasting legacy of the Great War for all to see, which is there today and hopefully will be there for all time. And that was done with the grace of the French people. The French government gave that land in perpetuity to the then Imperial War Graves Commission so that these cemeteries could be built and made permanent and be there for future generations such as us to visit and see and understand, to create this legacy that would go on way beyond the period of the Great War. So a fantastic question there, Eric, which again kind of hints at the importance of life and the history beyond the battlefield itself in our wider understanding of the First World War. So thanks for that and all of our questions this week. As always, you can send your questions in via email or via the Discord server, and there are links to both of those on the show notes for this episode. I hope you found the questions, and more importantly, the answers of interest, and until we meet again and discuss some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.